So I'm beginning a new series and I'm going to call it Russian Disinformation Exposed. And what I'm going to do is try to unpack the major disinformation talking points. And I'm going to do it not by just talking about it myself, but by showing it either in writing or in video. Here's what they're actually saying, and here's the truth, or here's the reality. So we're going to start with this one because one of the common talking points is that Ukraine's not even a nation. It's not even its own nation. It's really not. It's this mythological creation of these nationalist Banderites, and that's not reality. Putin himself says this kind of thing. Now here I want to show you what they're saying on their own talk show in Russia. Now, props to the Russian Media Monitor for having aggregated this for us and putting the English subtitles so that we can see it for ourselves. I'm going to read the words and then I'll periodically pause and comment. Okay, here we go. If your provider doesn't broadcast SolarVolve Live, lodge a complaint against them. I would advise you to complain to the FSB. Wait, did he just say complain? Essentially, translate that to America. Complain to the FBI if you can't watch Anderson Cooper or Sean Hannity. What? Okay. Greetings to the audience of Radio Vesti FM, the largest radio station in the nation. Amazingly, what's happening in Ukraine is a psychological phenomenon, taking into account that there is a war. Wait, he just called it a war. Somebody better send him to jail because you're not supposed to say a war. You're supposed to say a special military operation. Thousands of people have perished and will perish. Millions have become refugees and have lost everything. Nonetheless, I think that in the future, this will be a phenomenal interest for social psychologists, perhaps even more than the studies of Nazi Germany, which continue to this day. The phenomenon of turning an enormous, civilized, cultured, and great European nation into a multi-million horde of savages, sadists, and killers. Now, he's not talking about the Russians. He's talking about the Ukrainians being a multi-million horde of savages, sadists, and killers. That's what he's saying. Who were hated by the whole world. And they, in response, also hated the whole world. This is exactly what will happen to Ukraine. Again, if you just said that and you didn't know that he was talking about Ukraine, you might have understood that to be Russia. But he's talking about Ukraine. This is exactly what will happen to Ukraine, or rather the territory that used to be Ukraine. Okay, now they'll call it the territory known as Ukraine or some such language in order to say Ukraine's not actually a thing. It's not its own entity. My interest is purely as a layman. I'm truly at a loss. I've been to Kyiv countless times. When I say that Kyiv is a Russian city, it's not a figure of speech. It's an ideological mantra. It's not methodology. It's simply a fact. And what he's saying is Ukraine is Russia. It's not Russia. It is part of the historical heritage of these countries that have developed into two different peoples. And Ukrainians consider themselves different peoples. Just because you claim that they're not different people doesn't make it not a different people. Kyiv was, is, and will be a Russian city. Okay, they can't get over, like, it's almost like the obsessed boyfriend that can't get over that, you know, she left you, she just wasn't that into you, and you're just now obsessing with it, and I'm going to have you back or I'm going to destroy you. It's that kind of thing. It's a very strange thing to watch. They're kind of being stalkerish. Due to its origins, its culture, its code, its customs, its language, and its accent. But their language, their accent is different. Ukrainian isn't Russian, and there is a significant difference. Ask any Ukrainian. They'll tell you they're very different. Up until very recently, in Kyiv, they spoke better Russian than in Moscow. The way they spoke in Kyiv was simply amazing. They spoke such a pure, old, literary Russian language. Okay, but again, if you're talking about Ukrainian, it's different. No doubt they speak Russian in Ukraine as well, or have spoken Russian in Ukraine. I think that's largely evaporated since the beginning of the war. And you see this in statistical polling, and you find this in snippets of people talking about how, like, a professor wouldn't mark down when students wrote Russia with a lowercase r instead of a capital R because they This is their way of sticking it back to them. Having a good ear for music, I listened with amazement. I asked those people, "Where are you from?" They said, "We are from Kiev." I said, "You speak without an accent." They laughed at me with disdain. I was young and I didn't understand many things. And now the children of the same people from Kiev that I've encountered many years ago say that more than anything in the world, they would like to get rid of the Russian invaders. This is incredible, since they are Russian themselves. Okay, so they're Russian themselves, and they want to get rid of these Russian invaders. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, I mean, if you were coming into my neighborhood and blowing up my town and ruining my house and killing my family members, I'd kind of want to get rid of you too. How do you erase that part of your brain that controls your ethnic, cultural identity? Well, again, I mean, if you were bringing chocolates and flowers, that'd be one thing, but you're bringing bombs and ammunition, so it's a very different experience. So now there's generational hatred built up between you and Ukraine. You're like a stalker, and you can't see beyond your own rage that she doesn't want you anymore. Stop it. Lately, I've been talking a lot about this. Our media, our politicians, our official spokespeople, even they keep saying, and repeating, Ukrainians, Ukrainians, Ukrainians. Meaning what? At least half of Ukraine's population is Russian. Okay, now there's something to that. That's some part of the population, and I don't know that it's half, but a fraction of the population is Russian. And there's an even larger part of the population that spoke Russian first. Maybe even didn't speak Ukrainian, and that was kind of a normal thing. And it's a holdover, it's a hangover from the Soviet era when Russians were over the border in Ukraine and there was nothing that Ukrainians thought about it or could do about it, even if they did think about it. So there is part of that. Even Zelensky generally spoke Russian as he was growing up. So it was kind of a normal thing. He's kind of right. Why are you counting them as Ukrainians? Why are you taking them for granted? The fact, which is not even a fact, that in 1991 Yeltsin wanted to be in power so badly that he tore apart the Soviet Union along with historical Russia. Okay, so again, this comes down to Ukraine is part of historical Russia and we want it back. And that's the way that Russians really view what's going on in Ukraine. It's not like they're their own people and they should have their own say. Like they'll say that these 4 oblasts that they just gobbled up, they wanted their self-determination. So does the rest of the country. They want their self-determination. But you can't see that. For over 30 years, we took it for granted that Ukraine exists and that everyone who lives in Ukraine is Ukrainian. Why all of a sudden? Says who? Where did you get that? That's why here and on my Telegram channel, when I say and I write a slur for Ukrainians, I mean specifically the political Ukrainians. Okay, so now he's trying to parse the difference. These people who ideologically believe that they should be their own people, that's who I'm really chastising. No, because we're all brothers. We're all Russian. Right? That's what he's trying to say. These people whose ethnic origins have no meaning. They can be anyone at all. Ukrainians, Russian, Jews, Crimean Tatars, or even Tanzanians. But any person who takes on the identity as a citizen of independent Ukraine sings this hideous thing called the Ukrainian anthem. So let's pause for that for a second. The Ukrainian national anthem, the glory and freedom of Ukraine, has not yet perished. Well, as I'm speaking, we're 470 some odd days into the 3-day or 3-week special military operation. Looks like they were right. Let's keep going. Sings this hideous thing called the Ukrainian anthem, warps his brain by speaking someone else's language, which is not his native tongue. Wait a minute. Ukrainian is the native tongue of Ukrainians. Now, Russian is also spoken there too, but wow. I mean, like, wow. It is unfit for speaking. You can only sing in it. It is simply ridiculous. He rejects the huge body of Russian literature. He rejects himself, rejects the entire Russian culture. Again, there's a reason that Russian culture is being rejected. And it's being rejected for decades because of the way that you have treated your neighbor. So if you're really brothers, act brotherly. And if you, being Russian by culture, reject the Russian culture, what is left within you? What do you become? You simply become an animal. And this is the way that Russians think about Ukrainians who seek their own independence. Everything else that makes a human human, especially, pardon me, a civilized human, there is none of that in these people. That is, Ukrainians are subhuman, and they ought to be brought to heel, just like you would bring an animal to heel. That is why this is an incredible social phenomenon. When an enormous number of good, kind, sweet Russian people who speak and think in Russian, no one is putting a gun to their head, except the Russians, who are putting a gun to their head. I mean, literally putting a gun to their head. And yet he can't see this. But they willingly say, we need to get rid of Russia. Is Russia bothered by this? No. You can't get to us that way. Our feeling of national superiority, let's stop there. They do have a feeling of national superiority. I talked to someone who had lived in Russia for some time and was just astounded by how racist Russians were. And I don't mean racist in the way that we think of it in America with black, white, Hispanic, and multicultural, something like that. But really, and between Ukrainians and Russians, they look very similar. But there's an ethnic racism that if you are not Russian, like Moscow Russian, if you're something else within Russia or within their sphere, you're inferior. And I think that's what's coming out. Our feelings of national superiority, for which we have grounds, you'd have to agree, is so great that when some kind of an identity constructed by the people in the lowest stage of their development, again, look how they are looking down on Ukrainians and dehumanizing them. I read an interesting book a few years ago. I think it was called What It's Like to Go to War. And it was someone who had been in combat who was talking about how every army that goes to war with another has to somehow dehumanize them in order to be able to pull the trigger. Because it's kind of morally repulsive to pull the trigger against what you know to be another human being made in the image of God with hopes and dreams and aspirations just like you have. And so you see this, like look back at World War II. Germans were called Krauts, and the Japanese were Nips or other unflattering terms. And you find this again in Vietnam, you find this again in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you find this very commonly throughout the world. What he's doing is dehumanizing the Ukrainians. In the lowest stage of their development, his professor, I can't pronounce his name, a fictional character, said, when they try to insult us, it is just like when a dog barks at you on the street. Of course, you're not going to bark back at the dog. If this is a mad dog, hit it with a stick. Although I have pity toward the dogs. I have pity for dogs, but not pity for these people. Just think about it. Russian people say, we are not Russian. We should get rid of everything Russian. We're ready to kill the Russian within ourselves. That's because the Russian outside of ourselves is trying to kill us. Wow. We see an external manifestation of a mass insanity among many people, but of course, not all of them. We should remember this. We see and hear only the Gerdes, only people who are utterly insane. We don't see and don't hear normal people. They're silent. Of course, all of this is done for their sake as well, but is not done for them. It is for us. This is us. This is our land. They really, truly believe Ukraine is Russian land. And that's what's motivating this. Ukraine doesn't have its own existence. I want to say it was Brezhnev, or I can't remember who it was, but someone said famously that Ukraine or Russia without Ukraine is not an, or Russia with Ukraine is an empire. Without it, it's not. And I think that that's really what's motivating this in a significant way. This is our land. This is our land. This has to be repeated every single day. You can never have too much of that. This is simply our land. Where we will always lived, where they threw us out of. We swallowed it and said, oh well, okay, if we can't live here, we'll go someplace else. You know, you have another 11 time zones where you can live, right? You're one of the least densely populated countries on the planet. and you're worried about being kicked out of Ukraine. Okay, that's pretty much the end of it. But you heard from the horse's mouth. And look, what's being broadcast here is on radio for Russian consumption. This is the way Russians think, generally speaking, about what Ukraine is. Ukraine does not really exist. It's a fiction, is what they're saying. And you have to understand that to understand what's motivating them. Now, hopefully we've poked holes in that along the way, and we understand that, there's a reason that they don't want Russians on their territory. But let's go even farther. Ukraine has been its own independent nation, not once, multiple times. And they have stood alone. And they're trying to throw off an aggressor who wants to pull them back into the fold. And it's on the grounds that they're joining NATO, or they might join NATO. They couldn't have joined NATO in 2022 when they invaded, because there was an ongoing conflict within their borders, and the Russians know that they couldn't have joined NATO while there was a conflict within their borders. So that was a pretext. But why did the other countries, the Baltic states and Poland and Romania and all these other countries that used to be Warsaw Pact, part of the Soviet Union, why did they join NATO? Isn't that interesting? It's not that NATO was encroaching to the east, it's that they were running away from these aggressors. That's what was going on. So you have to understand that in the Russian mind, Ukraine does not actually exist. And if you understand that, then you're not going to deal with a straw man and make up excuses for them. You'll understand that this is what primarily motivates them. I hope this video on exposing Russian disinformation has been helpful to you. If it has, please give it a like or share. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the coffees. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.